A freight train almost 2 miles long is crawling through the south side of Chicago at 5 miles per hour. It has crossed more than 1,000 miles of open country in under 2 days, and now it is barely moving. The train is not broken. The track ahead is not blocked. It is waiting for something that has nothing to do with physics. It is waiting to change owners. Because in the middle of the American rail network, every long-distance shipment slams into an invisible wall, the exact place where one company's railroad ends and a rival company's railroad begins. But here is the detail almost nobody outside the industry realizes. Right now, in the summer of 2026, the biggest railroad deal in American history, $85 billion, backed by a lobbying blitz in Washington, is trying to erase that wall forever. To understand what is at stake, you have to understand what Chicago actually is. Roughly 1 in every 4 freight trains in the United States passes through the Chicago region. All 6 of the giant carriers known as Class I railroads converge there, BNSF and Union Pacific arriving from the west, CSX and Norfolk Southern arriving from the east, Canadian National and CPKC cutting through from the north and south. The metro area handles more than 500 million tons of freight every year, funneled across a web of track that was largely laid out in the 19th century, threading through more than 1,600 street-level rail crossings in northeastern Illinois alone. And in the middle of that web, the handoff happens. A Western railroad hauls a train from Los Angeles to Chicago. Then that train, sometimes stretching 12,000 feet from the lead locomotive to the last car, has to be transferred to an eastern railroad that will carry it onward to Atlanta, or New Jersey, or the port of Savannah. That transfer is not a handshake. It can mean pulling the train apart in a classification yard, sorting cars 1 block at a time, swapping crews, swapping locomotives, and dragging cuts of cars across the city on shared trackage where freight has historically moved at walking speed. But here is the part that makes it stranger. A shipment can cover the roughly 2,000 miles from Los Angeles to Chicago in about 2 days, then spend a shocking fraction of that time just getting across one city. The Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning puts the average terminal transit time for a carload of freight at 31 hours. Union Pacific's own chief executive, Jim Vena, has told investors the handoff takes 24 to 36 hours, and his earlier estimates ran as high as 2 to 3 days. 2,000 miles in 48 hours. Then 30 more hours to travel across a single metropolitan area. Which brings us to the news. In July of 2025, Union Pacific announced its intention to acquire Norfolk Southern in a deal valued at roughly $85 billion. Music. It would be the largest railroad merger in American history, and it would create something that has never existed in this country, not once, not even at the height of the railroad barons. A single railroad company operating coast to coast, able to move a train from a dock in Los Angeles to a warehouse in New Jersey without ever handing it to anyone. The industry calls it single-line service. Union Pacific calls it the first true transcontinental railroad. And if that phrase sounds strange to you, if you were taught in school that America built its transcontinental railroad more than 150 years ago, then you have just spotted the fault line this entire story runs along. Go back to May 10, 1869, Promontory Summit, Utah Territory. A ceremonial spike made of gold is tapped into a polished laurel tie. Telegraph operators flash the word "done" across the continent, and the nation celebrates the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Except that is not quite what was completed. What actually met at Promontory that day were 2 separate corporations. The Central Pacific had built eastward from Sacramento. The Union Pacific had built westward from Omaha. The track was continuous. The ownership never was. A shipment crossing the country in 1869 still had to be handed from one company to another, and that fracture, born at the very moment of the network's creation, never healed. For 157 years, the American rail map has been divided into an Eastern Kingdom and a Western Kingdom, with the border running roughly along the Mississippi River and with Chicago serving as the Great Gate between them. The geography made it almost inevitable. The Mississippi was a formidable barrier to 19th century bridge builders, and Chicago sat at the strategic pivot between the Great Lakes, the eastern industrial cities, and the open grain country of the West. Railroads from every direction raced to reach it, and none of them pushed far beyond it, because the traffic they craved was already there. Then came a century of brutal consolidation. In the early 1980s, more than 30 major freight railroads still operated in the United States. The Staggers Rail Act of 1980 stripped away decades of suffocating federal price regulation, freed railroads to compete, to abandon unprofitable lines, and, crucially, to merge. Silence. And the old names began to disappear. The Rock Island, a railroad that had carried freight across the plains for more than a century, was liquidated in 1980, the largest railroad shutdown America had ever seen. The Milwaukee Road tore up its own line to the Pacific and was absorbed. The Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central, once the mightiest corporations on Earth, had already collapsed into the Penn Central bankruptcy, at the time the largest corporate failure in American history. Whole systems that had employed generations of families were reduced to paint schemes and photographs. Railroaders have a name for them. Fallen flags. The survivors kept eating each other. Burlington Northern joined with the Santa Fe in 1995. Union Pacific swallowed the Southern Pacific in 1996. CSX and Norfolk Southern carved up Conrail between them in the late 1990s. Canadian Pacific took control of Kansas City Southern in 2023. Today, just 6 Class I railroads remain, and 4 of them handle nearly 90% of all American rail freight. Yet through all of that consolidation, one line was never crossed. No merger ever joined a Western giant to an Eastern giant. The kingdoms grew larger, but the border at the Mississippi held. Until now. And this is where the economics and physics get interesting. Why is handing off a train so expensive that a company would spend $85 billion to stop doing it? Start with the word interchange. Interchange simply means the transfer of freight cars from one railroad to another, and in Chicago, it happens in 2 ways. The first is steel wheel interchange, where an entire train or block of cars rolls directly onto the receiving railroad's track. The second is slower and stranger. For decades, containers arriving on a Western railroad have been lifted off the train, placed on trucks, and driven across the city through Chicago traffic to an Eastern Railroad's terminal, a practice known as crosstown drayage. Thousands of containers, moving across one of the most congested urban areas in America, one truck at a time, because 2 railroad companies could not run one train. Then there is the sorting. A manifest train carries cars bound for dozens of destinations, and at a classification yard, those cars are pushed over an artificial hill called a hump, uncoupled and rolled one by one into sorting tracks, where they wait, sometimes for a full day, to be reassembled into new trains. Every hour a car spends waiting is an hour it earns nothing. And in railroading, an idle car is worse than unproductive. It is billed. If you watched our video on buffer cars, you already know how strange railcar economics can get. The same system is at work here. Under the industry's car hire rules, a railroad pays rent, calculated by the hour, for every foreign freight car sitting on its network. The meter never stops. A car trapped in a Chicago yard is not just late. It is generating an invoice by the hour for the railroad holding it, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of cars every single day. Delay is not an abstraction. It is a line item worth millions. Now stack the rest of the costs. Crews must be swapped because a Western crew cannot simply keep driving onto an Eastern railroad. Locomotives are often exchanged. Air brake systems must be tested again before departure. And there is a physics penalty hiding under all of it. A loaded freight train can weigh 15,000 tons or more, and the single most fuel-hungry thing that train can do is accelerate that mass from a dead stop. A train that keeps rolling is one of the most efficient machines humanity has ever built. A train that stops, waits 30 hours, gets torn apart, rebuilt, and restarted, surrenders that efficiency at the exact midpoint of its journey. The whole ballet plays out on infrastructure so old and so tangled that in 1927, Chicago's transfer freights averaged 5 miles per hour, a number that would embarrass no one in the yards today. The region has spent enormous sums attacking the problem. A public-private program called CREATE has poured roughly $5.8 billion into 70 separate projects since 2003, including a $142 million flyover at Englewood, finished in 2014, just to lift one set of tracks over another. That is the price of untangling a knot, one strand at a time. Union Pacific's argument is that you should stop untangling the knot and simply cut it. A single-line transcontinental railroad would mean one waybill, one company, one train, rolling from a Pacific port to an Atlantic seaboard warehouse without ever pausing at the Mississippi to ask permission. No handoff, no crosstown drayage, no day lost to classification in the middle of the journey. The company argues that the time savings would let railroads finally claw back freight from long-haul trucking, which moves the overwhelming majority of American goods. On paper, the logic is almost embarrassingly clean. If you are enjoying this look inside the hidden machinery of American railroads, hit subscribe. Every week, we break down the money, the machines, and the history that keep freight moving across this continent. Because this is the point where the story swerves in a direction almost nobody predicted. The first surprise came from the data. In early 2026, a firm called RailState, which operates a network of trackside sensors, decided to actually measure the Chicago bottleneck that the merger application describes. Between February 1st and April 15th, its sensors tracked more than 40,000 eastbound containers moving from BNSF onto the two eastern railroads. The result complicated the story. More than half of the containers handed from BNSF to CSX cleared the entire Chicago region in under 10 hours, often with the same locomotives running straight through onto the receiving railroad. The truly slow corridor, averaging 28 hours for containers and roughly 36 hours for grain, was the one feeding Norfolk Southern, the very railroad Union Pacific wants to buy. In other words, the choke point is real, but it is not uniform, and some of the worst friction sits on the merging company's own side of the fence. The second surprise is what happened to labor. To understand it, you need 3 letters: PSR. Precision Scheduled Railroading, the operating doctrine that swept the industry over the past decade, taught railroads to move the same freight with fewer trains, fewer yards, fewer locomotives, and above all, fewer people. The Class 1 workforce has shrunk by roughly a quarter since 2016. The network that exists today has already been stripped to the bone, and the workers who remain remember exactly how each previous efficiency revolution was paid for. So when the largest railroad merger in history arrived promising synergies, everyone expected the unions to form a wall against it. Instead, Union Pacific did something no railroad had ever done. It started buying peace, one union at a time. In September of 2025, the company signed an agreement with SMART-TD, the largest rail union in the country, guaranteeing its train service members job protection for the length of their careers, with no involuntary furloughs as a result of the merger. Lifetime protection. Nothing like it had ever been offered in American railroading. SMART-TD, which had opposed the deal, reversed course and announced its support before the regulators. The carmen followed: the firemen and oilers, the boilermakers, the train dispatchers. By the spring of 2026, 6 national unions had signed similar deals and lined up behind the merger. But the wall did not fully crumble. The Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, now part of the Teamsters, and the maintenance of way workers who build and repair the track itself, refused to sign. Their leaders declared that the merger was being sold as progress, and that they were not buying it. Their argument is bigger than any single contract. Lifetime protection for today's workers says nothing about how many workers a monopoly railroad will ever hire again, and engineers remember that every merger in railroad history arrived wrapped in promises. Then came the politicians and the shippers. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer condemned the deal as a hostile takeover of America's infrastructure, warning of dangerous consolidation and monopoly power. Senators from farm states, Democrat and Republican alike, pressed regulators about captive shippers, the grain elevators and chemical plants served by only one railroad, who would have even less leverage in a market of giants. The American Farm Bureau raised the same alarm. For a farmer in Kansas, the promise of faster service to the East Coast means very little if the only railroad in town gains the power to name its price. And then there are the rivals. The remaining Class I railroads understand the arithmetic instantly. If one true transcontinental railroad exists, every other carrier becomes a regional player competing against a company that never has to hand off a train. Analysts and industry executives have warned that approval would all but force a final wave of consolidation, collapsing the North American network into two coast-to-coast giants, a duopoly running the arteries of the entire economy. Wall Street, for its part, has already priced in the dream. Investors spent a decade rewarding every railroad that cut its way to a lower operating ratio. And a merged transcontinental system is the logical endpoint of that entire philosophy, the ultimate efficiency play, protected from competition by the simple fact that nobody can build a second one. Which is why every eye in the industry is now on a small federal agency most Americans have never heard of. The Surface Transportation Board, a 5-seat board appointed by the president, holding near absolute authority over railroad mergers. And the board carries a scar that explains everything about how carefully it is moving. The last time Union Pacific attempted a merger of this scale, the takeover of Southern Pacific in 1996, the integration went so badly that it triggered one of the worst service meltdowns in modern railroad history. Trains gridlocked across Texas and the Gulf Coast. Freight sat for weeks. Shippers hemorrhaged money, and the crisis dragged on for months while regulators scrambled to force emergency measures. That disaster, along with the chaos that followed other mergers of that era, pushed regulators to adopt a far tougher merger standard in 2001, one that requires any future mega merger to actively enhance competition, not merely avoid destroying it. No combination of giant railroads has ever been tested against that standard. The Canadian Pacific and Kansas City Southern deal slipped through under the older, gentler rules. Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern will be the first to face the hard version, and the board has already shown its teeth. Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern filed their formal merger application on December 19, 2025. On January 16, 2026, the board unanimously rejected it as incomplete, finding that it lacked required market analyses and even a full copy of the merger agreement itself. The companies refiled on April 30th. On May 28th, the board accepted the revised application, but in the same breath it froze the proceedings, holding the entire review in abeyance, environmental study included, and ordering the railroads to submit supplemental information by July 27th of 2026. That deadline is only weeks away as this video is published. A final decision is not expected before 2027, and the stakes of failure are written directly into the merger contract itself. If the deal collapses under certain conditions, Union Pacific owes Norfolk Southern a reverse termination fee of $2.5 billion. That is the price of walking away, not of failing, just of trying and falling short. So weigh the two sides of the scale honestly. On one side sits an efficiency argument that is genuinely powerful. The Chicago handoff is a relic, a tax on every transcontinental shipment, paid in hours, fuel, and money, imposed not by geography, but by corporate boundaries drawn in the 19th century. Erasing it would make American freight faster and cheaper, and might pull thousands of trucks off the interstates. On the other side sits everything history teaches about railroad monopolies. An industry already reduced to 6 companies, already stripped of its spare capacity by precision-scheduled railroading, already strained to the point where a single derailment or a single bad winter ripples across the continent for weeks. A merged network with no competitor and no slack is a network with zero margin for error, and the people who load the grain, drive the locomotives, and inspect the brakes are the ones who absorb the consequences when the margin runs out. There is also a quieter question underneath all of it. Once a true transcontinental railroad exists, it can never be uncreated. Regulators can attach conditions, monitor pricing, demand service guarantees, but no agency has ever broken a modern railroad back apart, and no rival will ever raise the hundreds of billions of dollars it would take to build a competing network from nothing. Whatever the board decides, it will be deciding permanently. Here is the thought worth carrying away. The battle being fought in Washington in 2026, with its billions of dollars and its armies of lawyers, is entirely about lines drawn by men in frock coats before the invention of the light bulb. The Mississippi Divide, the Chicago Gateway, the Eastern and Western Kingdoms, all of it dates to an era of telegraphs and steam. The Golden Spike of 1869 joined 2 railroads and promised one nation of steel. 157 years later, that promise has still never been kept by a single company, and we are about to find out whether it ever will be. Somewhere on the south side of Chicago tonight, another 2-mile train is creeping toward the handoff at 5 miles per hour, waiting for permission to change owners, exactly as trains have waited there for more than a century. Whether that wait is a historical inefficiency about to be abolished, or the last safeguard against a railroad empire with no rival, depends entirely on a decision that has not been made yet. If you found this deep dive into the hidden economics of America's railroads useful, consider subscribing. We cover the engineering, history, and hidden logic of freight railroads every week. Let me know in the comments whether you think the merger should be approved. The video playing next goes deeper into how precision-scheduled railroading is reshaping the industry. Click it, and we will see you there.